but as a citizen, and as a father of 4 children, I know that the way you propose is the only way we will have a future on this planet. And I tell you this story out of one reason. I think that still too many decisions on this earth have been or are taken out of egoistic interests of powerful groups. But behind all these interests, there are people, citizens, that have a common interest. And the very important question for us, for the Green Movement, will be how to organize this common interest of every citizen, of all people on this world, and not only people, of all beings on this world, of everything that shares this world with us, how to organize this interest against the interest of organized interest groups, lobby groups, and so on. And this is the very question of democracy. We are going to have a workshop on direct democracy this afternoon, which means not to give away your vote in the elections and then just look at it for 4 or 5 years, but to have the citizens brought in, citizen initiative, referenda, and so on. So this is, from my point of view, after 30 years of work, the basic, the most important question: who takes the decisions and how? We're going to have the panel on mitigation, on climate change now, and I'd like to invite the first speaker now. It's Russell Norman from New Zealand. Russell Norman is actually the co-leader of the Greens in New Zealand. He's a member of Parliament, and there he's spokesperson for climate change, for environment, and also for finance and economic issues. Russell Norman, would you please speak to us?
Tēnā koutou, thank you very much. It's great to be here. This is a pretty short panel, and I thought what I'd use my 5 minutes talking about was the issue around price on carbon. And what I wanted to talk about was the role of a price on carbon and the discussion around the different mechanisms that are available to us. The first thing I'd say is that we've taken the view that a price on carbon is an essential part of a mitigation strategy to reduce greenhouse emissions. We've taken the view that it's essential, but by itself it's not enough. That you need all of the complementary measures that go alongside it, such as regulation, but that the price itself is necessary if we are to reduce greenhouse emissions. So that was, from our point of view, it was important that we utilise the power of markets by changing relative prices. We can use markets to reduce greenhouse emissions. By itself, it's not enough, but it's an essential component. The second thing I wanted to talk about was then the 2 different options that are on the table in terms of putting a price on greenhouse emissions. So the 2 options on the table fundamentally are some kind of an emissions trading scheme or some kind of carbon charge. Now the Green Party of Aotearoa New Zealand we've supported a carbon charge ahead of an emissions trading scheme. That's been our preference. But we did actually vote for an emissions trading scheme that was passed in New Zealand a year or so ago. For various reasons, it was the best option on the table. But I just wanted to talk briefly about those 2 methods of putting a price on carbon. In terms of an emissions trading scheme, it seems to me that one of the key parameters or issues with an emissions trading scheme is that the cap has to be real and it has to be sinking quickly. And the speed of the sinking of the cap on emissions has to be related to the science. So if we're going to go down an emissions trading scheme path, the cap has to be sealed and not leak, that is the cap on greenhouse emissions, and it has to drop as fast as the science says that it needs to drop. So for example, one of the proposals is 25 to 40% reductions by 2020 for NX1 countries. So the problem with a lot of emissions trading schemes that are being proposed around the planet is that the cap isn't sealed. That is, there is dramatic leakage, lots of free credits given away to polluting industries, and hence vast subsidies. And so it's not sealed, and also it's not sinking very quickly. So not only is it the cap not really working, but it's not really going down very quickly. And fundamentally, if you don't have a rapidly sinking cap with an emissions trading scheme, the scheme doesn't work. The second part of an emissions trading scheme that's essential for it to function is the recycling of the revenue. It seems to me that if we don't have the recycling of the revenue generated by an emissions trading scheme, so that it's going back to citizens in particular, but also to some extent to companies that are reducing their emissions, then the system won't work properly because it won't get the political buy-in that's necessary for the system to work. So those are the kind of two key criteria. One is a cap based on the science, and the second is what happens to the money, and is there a transfer of money back to ordinary people. But the advantages of an emissions trading scheme, in terms of its advantages, the advantage is that it targets a level of greenhouse emissions, and then price is left to do what price wants to do. So you target a level of greenhouse emissions, the cap, and price is left to do whatever the market says the price will do. So that's in some ways a serious advantage of an emissions trading scheme, because it does target the actual issue, which is greenhouse emissions, and price is led to do as it wants. Of course, the disadvantage of an emissions trading scheme, as I talked about earlier, is that there's tremendous problems with the cap, and giveaways given away everywhere, and also it can be an immensely complicated system to administer, and the complexity is part of the reason why it doesn't work. In terms of a carbon charge, the second option on the table in terms of putting a price on greenhouse emissions, the thing about a carbon charge, if it's going to work, is that the price has to be high enough to have a serious impact, and it has to escalate over time. If we are to reduce our emissions, then what we're targeting here is the price, and the price has to start high and start moving up quite rapidly. The kind of level of price you need is quite significant in order to have real reductions in greenhouse emissions. The advantages of a carbon charge are that it's relatively simple, it's relatively transparent compared to an emissions trading scheme. The disadvantage of a carbon charge is that it doesn't target greenhouse emissions, it targets a price. And what that means is that if you target a price and your greenhouse emissions still increase too much, and so you need to increase the price, then every time you want to increase the price, you have to go through a battle which says we want to increase the tax on carbon because we want to reduce emissions. So in some ways it's a politically more difficult thing to do, because you have to increase the tax each time, even though your real target is the emissions. So one of the limitations of a carbon charge is that it doesn't directly target the thing that is of concern, which is the greenhouse emissions. It only indirectly targets greenhouse emissions. But nonetheless, generally in the context, we've supported a carbon charge because of its simplicity and its relative transparency, as opposed to emissions trading schemes. Just very briefly, the situation in New Zealand now is that we originally introduced an emissions trading scheme that had good recycling of revenue. It was connected to a very large home insulation scheme with some of the revenue. It had a relative breadth in its coverage of all sectors. New Zealand has a major problem with agriculture. Our agricultural emissions are about half of all our emissions. And so we supported the original ETS, the original emissions trading scheme. Since then, the ETS has been watered down very significantly, and to such an extent that we no longer support it as a way of actually addressing greenhouse emissions, because it's been watered down and so many holes have been put in the cap that it's not going to work anymore to reduce greenhouse emissions. In fact, in our system there is no longer a cap. The cap's effectively been removed. So I'll leave it there. That's a very brief intro to pricing for greenhouse emissions, and a very brief introduction to the situation in New Zealand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norman. And now I would ask Namiho Matsumoto